BG3 just got its massive brand new patch 1 update, and we'll go over all the details with that, as well as some massive news for Xbox gamers. We also got some additional tips and tricks and even a new Act 2 checklist. Let's just jump right into it. What's up, World Stripper? Back in the video, we're checking out all things BG3. Okay, so first up, obviously, let's go right into the patch notes. They have this little header here that I think gives us a nice little kind of description on how the patch will be. It said, "Hello everyone, today we are releasing our first major patch for BG3, addressing over 1,000 bugs, balancing, flow issues, and much more." And they said that patch 1 is too big for our usual patch notes due to Steam's character limit. So the full patch notes will be here. I'll make sure to have this link and the Steam page link just in case you want to read either one. This update, they brought a ton of new NPC fixes, and sometimes that wouldn't be there or certain things would happen. They fixed the floating items like mugs and newspapers, which I definitely noticed that in certain conversations. And a bit of a spoiler here, I won't say who it is exactly, but there is a companion character that has an ending scene that wasn't triggering for a lot of players, and yeah, that actually happened to me as well. And they did say that the significant performance updates will be implemented into patch 2, however that won't be very long. They said it's right around the corner, and they will give more detail and closure to its release. They also gave some cool stats here. It says that, did you know collectively you've played over 200 million hours of BG3 since launch? That's over 22,000 years collectively, which those numbers are just insanely hard to process given the context of them. They also went on to say here that the most popular class choice is currently Paladin, followed by Sorcerer, and the least popular class goes to Cleric. They said that the human and elf characters reign supreme and are at the top, followed swiftly and unsurprisingly by Half-Elf. On the opposite end of the spectrums, we have Dwarf, Gnome, Githyanki, and Halfling. Now, of course, they did mention here, they said, please bear in mind that a lot of this stuff is spoilers territory. Although I won't go over the spoiler territory stuff, I'll kind of just cover the main reworks to the game that improve your gameplay. That way, if you did want to check out these story spoilers, there's just too many complexities there with that, at least to cover on a video basis and to know exactly where everybody is at in the story. Now, they have this category as the showstoppers, which is like kind of like the major reworks. There's a ton of stuff with the end game fixes and things like that. Again, I'm not going to go into it. If you've had any issues in Act 3 and towards the later of the half of the game, there is a bunch of fixes there. Here's a big one though that should fix a lot of quality of life stuff here, which is that there was a bug when listening in on conversations as player 1 and then exiting the dialogue prematurely could result in not being able to interact with anything anymore. They also fixed an issue causing the reaction of the UI to not work correctly and potentially block progress in combat if you save the game in the middle of the reaction. They also fixed loot and corpses sometimes not appearing in multiplayer until an item was dragged onto a corpse, which does seem like a major kind of, not game-breaking issue, but definitely a major issue for multiplayer. They also fixed a bug causing you to get a game over screen after helping a downed party member. I never encountered that one, but that one's kind of funny. There was also a helmet that was causing the game to crash, and that certain condition with the helmet was now capped at 7 stacks. They also fixed an issue attacking an NPC during a dialogue after being downed will now get you arrested rather than giving you a game over screen. Again, kind of another funny bug there with that one. Fixed an issue where characters could get stuck in an infinitely falling loop. And they also fixed an issue with a certain NPC being resurrected by players hitting him with a dual-wield attack. The second hit would no longer revive him. So there's some good fixes there with that. There's also a ton of story flow and logic fixes here. Conditionals on different things that were applying not correctly in certain scenarios. There's also different companion things that were not supposed to happen or were supposed to happen, or even follow-ups that were supposed to happen that didn't or weren't there. There's also a bunch of Act 2 NPCs that look to be fixed, as well as even some Act 1 NPCs that had a bunch of fixes around either disappearing or not correctly prompting certain scenarios. Now, the big one here is balance. They made gold bounties more generous in several containers across the game. They increased the player's HP in Explorer mode from 50 to 100%, which is kind of crazy. When I checked the difference of Tactician to Explorer mode, I had so much more health. I was amazed. And now even more than that, that's kind of nice though, because I do believe for my second playthrough, I'm probably just going to play on Explorer, just so I can have a bit of fun with the game, and I've already beaten it on Tactician. Although part of me doesn't really want to go against that and kind of still want to play on Tactician. They fixed a certain tadpole power from properly resetting on a long rest. Essentially, it was creating an infinite spell slot and sorcery points for sorcerers. Now you can also no longer have multiple mage hands working at the same time. There were some other items there tied to the mage hand that were also causing some issues. There's a bunch of other magic and sorcery fixes here with that, so if you've been encountering any bugs with sorcerer or even wizard, there is a bunch of fixes there. A big fix here is that the NPCs sometimes were spotting you even though they're not supposed to be able to. They fixed a lot of different combat scenarios and their edge cases. Now another spoiler warning here, I'm not going to go into who it is, but for endgame, and if you are in Act 3 and you are near the end, one of the bosses at the endgame actually did get their HP and AC increased. If you've already beaten the game, you know exactly who this is because they had much lower health, at least comparative to other bosses, especially even Act 2 bosses. They also enabled an additional check for trespassing warnings, so those wouldn't immediately be triggered afterward. They actually give you an additional checkpoint. They also had some usability fixes here that were quite major. The launcher will now remember whether you choose DX11 or Vulcan. They had a bunch of comments down below saying that Vulcan crashes for them and that DX11 is better. I've always had better experiences with DX12 and Vulcan, at least over DX11, but if it's crashing for you, then just use DX11. They also had a bunch of fixes for the incorrect amount of gold being displayed in the UI. There was a couple multiplayer fixes for the camp supply values for the second player. They also improved the performance of the minimap when new markers would appear or old ones disappear. There was also some additional visual fixes. They fixed some earrings on the tiefling female strong character models. They also had some helmet fixes and some adjustments there with that. And this additional one is kind of spoilery, but not really. Undergoing partial ceremorphosis will now rot your teeth. So I assume using those upgrade powers, those Elithid upgrade powers, are now going to rot your teeth if you are constantly using them. Which, yeah, for my playthrough, I didn't use any of them. I didn't even use any powers at all, and I never even saw the skill tree for it. There's also a bunch of cinematic fixes here, but I won't go into those because those are a lot of spoiler stuff, and just know that there's a ton of stuff being worked on with that. There's a loot and trade section here, which is really cool. The traders who stock dyes now also have stock dye remover. The fish vendors will now have more fish to sell. Yeah, I always noticed that like the side vendors or some of the fish vendors had like 2 items in them. It seems like some of the skeleton NPCs around a certain area were having fresh food in their inventory. And yeah, that didn't quite make too much sense. There were some other minor miscellaneous fixes here. There were some NPCs that were idle, which their sounds were causing a use of some streaming bandwidth. So hopefully that does help with some performance fixes. They fixed a ton of crashes, especially the one in the Vulcan API. So if you do want to try Vulcan again, maybe you can. I did look at the Digital Foundry video and it seems like it does give worse performance. However, if you look at the 1% lows, it actually does offer a little bit better performance in that section. I don't know why for me, but it's always, Vulcan is always, or even DX12 has always provided way better performance for me than it's a DX11. I'm just going to stick for Vulcan for now, but just know that there is some fixes there if you do want to try the other one. Again, a ton of other crash fixes in the other sections of the game as well. There's also a bunch of multiplayer fixes with saving and loading warnings. A ton more combat changes and combat fixes. A lot of this stuff is spoiler territory and specific to certain NPCs. There's also a bunch here that is significant to Tactician mode. They also made a few select NPCs a lot harder in Tactician mode. However, these are very minor NPCs and they're designated to very specific scenarios. There's a ton of spells that got fixed in certain scenarios, like Cloud of Daggers was not really engaging in hostile combat a lot of times. In fact, there was a certain area where I could cast Cloud of Daggers and it wouldn't initiate me in combat at all. So I definitely did deal with that one. There's Telekinesis, Stone Skin, there's a bunch here, Minor Illusion. All of these had like infinite loop or crashing or other issues that were fixed. Most of these were just general fixes to the actual ability and not complete reworks. The gameplay section had a ton of XP changes and things that weren't being valued to you in certain scenarios, so you should be gaining even more XP and leveling even quicker. There's also a section here for the journal in Act 3. It had a bunch of changes and improved updates in there, so if you're experiencing any issues in Act 3, they have a ton of updates for it, and now it should be correctly updating your journal. Most of the other things here are also edge cases to specific NPCs and specific quests. They had a bunch of changes in the writing department. Most of this stuff pertained to UI and the descriptions there with that, or incorrectly displaying certain things in certain scenarios. There's also some additional dialogue with certain NPCs and even companions. A specific one here, not really too much of a spoiler, but Gale actually did get some additional dialogue added, which should give some more clarity around the sort of engagement that you have with him. They also changed that keys now cost 1 gold instead of 0. They also made some changes on the character creation and level up screen where there was some clipping issues, and there was also some frame delay issues that were causing some weird introductions with the origins. It was actually one of the major issues I talked about in the previous videos, that Drow were not receiving or getting Dancing Light cantrip from the character creation screen. So now they will actually correctly receive Dancing Lights. They fixed a ton of unreachable items, and yeah, I had a few of them that I couldn't get to, especially being a gnome, but even switching to my origin characters, they couldn't get it either. UI tooltips got a bunch of fixes for correctly or incorrectly popping up in certain scenarios. They also changed the level design stuff and mapping, along with a ton of animation and art fixes that pertain to specific NPCs, and again, a lot of spoiler stuff here. They also made some major audio adjustments here, and there was a ton of these. That includes an entire separate section for the SFX, and even the VFX. It should cover for the patch notes. There is a ton here that I didn't cover. There's a lot in this patch notes. I'd be here reading these all day, so if you want to check out the rest of them, I'm going to have a link to everything down below. We did have that Xbox news that I wanted to cover very, very briefly here, and that is that the fact that Xbox is actually getting the parity clause dropped. We had a tweet here from Sven who said, "Super happy to confirm that after meeting Xbox P3 yesterday, we found a solution that allows us to bring Baldur's Gate 3 to Xbox players this year, something we've been working towards for quite some time." We had a follow-up tweet here that said, "All improvements will be there with split-screen co-op on Series X, and Series S will not feature split-screen co-op, but will also include cross-save progression between Steam and Xbox Series." That is some massive news for Xbox gamers, and yeah, hopefully they get the game sometime soon. At least it's before the end of the year, and it looks to be after Starfield, and so you got time for Starfield and other games. But that should about cover for today's video. If you like it, subscribe, and until next one, deuces.